Welcome back to Bring It Home. This is the 8th in a series of lectures on Homeland Security, national security, strategy, war, and terrorism, in which we're trying to take these concepts and bring them home to you. And today we're going to talk about the issue of insights into terrorism. This is a follow-on to previous lectures where we talked about what is war and the nature of war, insights from war, how it's waged, and then how terrorism is different and what is the nature of terrorism. Today we're going to look at those insights. As a very brief review, let me remind you that war is violence for political ends. It's waged under a set of rules. Now, a lot of people don't like this point because they say nations disregard the rules all the time. That's true. But it is true that they start with, they understand, they are bound with, to some degree, some set of rules, operating procedures between nations. You have to have some set of rules if one side is going to surrender to another. The nature of war is constantly changing. It's a balance we talked about between passion and reason. And that balance is influenced and thrown out of kilter by the concept of chance. So war constantly threatens to spin out of control. What we're trying to do is control war in order to lead to victory. Victory being getting what you're willing to settle for at a price you're willing to pay. And so we craft a strategy in order to achieve that control. A strategy is just a theory of cause and effect to achieve victory against a thinking enemy over time. These strategies will include a political strategy, an economic strategy. There'll be a military component. New in the last few years, we began talking about the information component of strategy. And all of that, you have to remember, you have to speak to the people at home, not just an enemy overseas. And so the acronym that's used is DIME or DIME-D. Diplomacy, information, military, economic strategy, as well as a domestic strategy. And then Clausewitz tells us that we can strike at a number of centers of gravity as we wage war. We can strike at the people, at the military forces, or we can strike at the leadership. And we can attack in each of these their capability or their will. So that's how you end up bombing. Are you going to bomb homes and try to terrify people, or are you going to, which frankly many people regard to not be within the rules, or are you going to strike the sinews, the economic sinews, or attack railroads, or are you going to go straight after the leaders? This is how you wage war. Therefore, there's a logic, in other words, to waging war. You understand the war, you understand the enemy and yourself, you understand the nature of war, the enemy and yourself. Strategy creates your operations tell you what tactics you have to use. Tactics suggest what fighting forces and weapons you need, and for all of this you use all the national resources and elements of national power at your disposal. The problem is that terrorism is different. Is it violence waged for a political end? Yes, but it's not just war because it's waged outside the rules. Is it just crime? No, it's not, because it's for a political end. You can't just use law enforcement to deal with terrorism. Terrorism is, in fact, criminal war. It is, at its core, it's cheating. Now, some people don't like this term because it suggests that the states are always fair and the terrorists are not. That's not the case. What we said is that terrorism provides an unfair advantage. If one side's expecting to play by certain rules, for example, we don't attack civilians, and the other side says your civilians are fair game, then that side has an advantage. It unbalances the trinity. In fact, terrorism is designed to destroy control, to destroy the legitimacy of the system. The implications are that because you're using complex ways, means, and ends, complicated by illegality, that your solutions are going to be very complex as well. Very briefly, there are lots of potential ends in terrorism, very complex. You might be trying to separate, the terrorist might be trying to separate themselves from another country. They might be trying to overthrow. They might be trying to return, as happened in France and Algeria, might be trying to return to a former leadership or way of doing business. This is what the Ku Klux Klan used terrorism for. It might have a religious basis. It might be just about some single issue or economics. The point is that it could have very, very complex origins. It could be that the organization is just trying to survive and it went to terrorism in order to generate publicity for itself. Or it could be that it's trying to secure new resources and say, see, we're the ones who are actually fighting, we're the ones who are actually destroying the enemy, send your resources to us. It could be that this is a newly emerging opportunity. There's a new center because, for example, the Americans have established a base in Saudi Arabia so we can attack them now. Or it could be there isn't any alternative. The enemy's simply so strong you have to attack using terrorism. And it can be that it fills a psychological need, that this is not even about some final end, but it's about the way people feel better. They feel like they're oppressed, and they feel better when they use terrorism. So the problem is there's no simple, single reason or purpose for using terrorism. We didn't care why the individual Japanese infantryman was waging war. He was raised, trained, equipped by a state. We only had to worry about battling the state. Here we have to worry about all of these reasons. So terrorism can be very complex also in the ways that it's waged. For example, it can be waged state against state, as Libya against the United States. Non-state can be a victim from a state, as the Nazis waged against the Jews. A non-state might wage war against a state, Al-Qaeda against the U.S. Or finally, a non-state might wage against a state, as we saw in Rwanda. In addition to the complexity then of state versus state, state versus non-state, non-state versus state, and non-state versus non-state, very complex set of ways in which force may be used, we can see that applying then the strategy is going to be very difficult. How do you apply diplomacy, information, military, economic strategy? How do you prepare your domestic audience when there are these wide variety of ways in which the narrative is being played out? People are used to state against state within a set of rules. How do you explain this new situation to them? Terrorism is very complex in the means that are employed. Again, if we look at state versus state and so forth, within that, in each case, you might be countering using force against the people, the forces, or the leadership. And you might attack their will or their capability. And remember how we said within a war, this is always like you have these 6 different targets? But this now can be played out between 2 states, as for example, when Libya attacked the United States. It can be played out between state and non-state, as for example, when the Nazis attacked the Jews, and you can attack, again, leadership or people, or their capabilities, their will, or you can attack their capability or their wills, either one. It can be played out between non-state and non-state, as in Rwanda, where you attack leadership. Where you see how complex this gets and how quickly. And in addition, all of that can be done with illegal means. So that's the reason this is so hard to get your mind around. The point here is that war is very simple compared to terrorism. You have to understand the nature and the purpose or the ends for which war is waged, the context. You select an objective, you select a strategy, you translate that into operations, and from that into weapons and tactics, and then you just wage the war and adjust it between nation states. How much more complicated terrorism makes every aspect of these decisions. The implication then is terrorism is criminal war, and this changes everything. The mechanisms of police and law are involved but can't resolve the problem. The mechanism of the military is involved but can't resolve the problem. It's waged against the legitimacy of the system. Everything the terrorist does is an attempt to overthrow that legitimacy. So terrorism is very complex, and victory, therefore, is going to be long and extremely difficult. So what are the implications here? What's the most important thing for you to understand? I think it's that the people, the leaders, and the forces have got to understand the incredible complexity of this issue. You're not going to get a simple narrative. You're not going to get a simple solution. You're not going to get a simple victory. It's not going to happen overnight, because on their side, you have to find all the reasons people are waging terrorism and unwrap them. We'll address this next time in our final lecture in this series, if you'll join us again on Bring It Home.